Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation on expectancy violations theory. My research project is EVT, Are Expectancy Violations in Developing Romantic Relationships Too Hot to Handle? Expectancy violations theory as a concept discusses expectancies, which denote an enduring pattern of anticipated behavior. Expectancy violations theory as a concept analyzes how individuals respond to behaviors that deviate from their expectations, as well as how they respond communicatively to those violations. So, in other words, this theory is rather self-explanatory, and it analyzes how we react to behaviors from other individuals that we did or did not predict to happen. In sum, for those who have not seen Too Hot to Handle, it is a short series in which 10 attractive single men and women are sent on a tropical retreat. They find out after arrival that sex and physical interaction altogether is off the table, and to win the grand prize of $100,000, the entire group has to abstain. Any failure to abide by these rules results in deduction from the pool, and that amount deducted depends on the severity of the act. The reason why these individuals in particular were chosen for the show is because they have a strong presence on social media in terms of body image and attractiveness and are known to be physical people who don't seek out long-term romantic relationships. So, our couple in question is Rhonda and Sharon. Rhonda would rate herself a 10 out of 10 and is especially proud of her butt, and Sharon is a self-declared feminist who studied women and gender studies in college, which he says is a blueprint on how to pick up women in a grocery store. So this gives us a little idea of the kind of people Rhonda and Sharon are upon entering this retreat. So my research questions are, number one, what expectations does each individual, Rhonda and Sharon, have upon entering the relationship? Number two, what type of violation valences does each individual commit during the development of the relationship, positive or negative, and how often? And three, what sort of feedback, praise, criticism, or advice following what violation valence is the most frequent in the initiation and maintenance of a developing relationship? So as I go on, I'm going to further explain what feedback is and why it's related to expectancy violations. In terms of my method, I rewatched every single episode of Too Hot to Handle. I won't be including episode 6 simply because it didn't include Rhonda and Sharon as individuals or as a couple. I particularly focused on instances when the two were either talking to each other directly, to other contestants, or to the camera about one another and their situation. I took general notes about the types of feedback that followed each interaction and the valence of the violation. So, jumping into our first research question, looking at Rhonda's expectations that she has upon entering the relationship. For men in general, she likes a guy with a job and tattoos and expects to find a guy who can, quote, handle her. When she meets Sharon, she says that, quote, Sharon is definitely my ideal guy. So overall, Rhonda expects more out of a guy than just sex. She wants a partner and someone that her 2-year-old son approves of. Physical attraction, of course, has to be there, though, and I note that her 2-year-old son wasn't mentioned until later in the show because that provides a valenced violation later on. And now looking at Sharon's expectations upon entering the relationship. About women in general, upon entering the retreat, he says he expects to reel them in, and he says there are so many good-looking girls here, I don't know where to start. And when he meets Rhonda, he says, we're going to go all the way. I can tell she's into me. Of course, not to her face. He says that to the camera afterwards. So overall, Sharon expects not much more out of a girl and a partner than physical attraction and sex. He just doesn't see himself in a long-term relationship after previous heartbreak a few years before, which is, again, something we'll address later on. So first, let's take a look at the violations committed by Sharon. For research question 2, we're looking at the negative and positive violations committed by Sharon. On the negative side, we have the fact that he woke up Rhonda at 2:30 in the morning to break the rules with him in the shower. He also said, I'm not coming out of this in a relationship, I'm not going to leave with love, when he was accused of breaking the rules amongst the group. He also states, when Rhonda asks about that specific scenario, that he is, quote, always going to have a wall up and, quote, knows himself that he will not be able to make it much longer without sex. All of these happened in the earlier stages of the relationship. So going from the earlier stages to the later stages, we have a shift from negative to positive. So later on, we have these positive violations such as vowing to Rhonda to be more honest with her, to communicate his emotions, and to be more trusting of others, and work through his past, which he said to her during a date that was set up for them by the producers. He also was open and excited about meeting Rhonda's son, which She didn't even mention it until later on, but he still was really accepting of it. He did not want to break the rules to prove their connection, even when they were given the opportunity to. And he said to her on their final date that, "I don't want to lose you. I want you to know this is real," and asked her to be his girlfriend. So a huge shift from negative to positive as time goes on. And now moving on to Rhonda's expectancy violations. Starting with negatives, she did not respond positively to being woken up at 2:30 in the morning for sex, which clearly that makes sense. She was not patient with Sharon's emotions. She began pursuing other men, the specific man David, after being told Sharon had a wall up. And she clearly was having a really good time with David in the group setting. So David, in particular, was one of the first guys that Sharon had a really good friendship with in the beginning of the retreat and going through the entire retreat. So when Sharon saw that Rhonda was kicking it off with him, it didn't exactly go over well. Some positive violations were that before the rules were in place, Rhonda reciprocated physical contact with Sharon, which she didn't necessarily expect. She also talked to Sharon through his past heartbreak and helped him realize that he can get past it. So if we go from this negative violation of being impatient with emotions to positive getting through those emotions and helping him through them. And she is open and honest about her son, which is, again, something that she didn't mention until later on in the show, but is something that was a positive reciprocation on both ends. So we have the negatives, again, happening towards the beginning of the relationship, and the positives happening towards the end. So now we're moving on to the third research question, which looks at the sorts of feedback, praise, criticism, and advice, and how often they occur. So whenever there was a negatively valenced violation, it was always followed with either criticism or advice. In this situation, it was mostly followed with criticism. So, for example, when Sharon said, quote, "I'm not coming out of this in a relationship," Rhonda responded with a look of surprise and disgust and later asked why he said that. That is an example of criticism. And as a positive example, after Sharon vowed to be more open with her, Rhonda replied with, quote, "That's all I needed to hear." A positive violation being responded to with praise. So it's pretty much self-explanatory. Praise is the reciprocation of a positive valenced violation, and criticism or advice, in this case mostly criticism, is what followed a negative violation. And the same thing happened here with Rhonda. When Rhonda was pursuing David, Sharon responded with ignoring David as a friend and Rhonda as a romantic interest. Even though it is nonverbal, it is still criticism to a negatively valenced violation. And if you'll notice, more of the positive violations and praise came later in the relationship, where the negative was more in the beginning. So here are some general findings. Like I said, positive always met with positive feedback, and negative always met with negative feedback. Advice specifically, which is a feedback from negative violations, was not as commonly seen, only in one specific instance. Most of the negatively valenced violations occurred in the earlier stages, like I said, with disclosure and assimilation to one another, and positive violations occurred later, gaining more predictability with one another. I also found that expectancy violations can be a combination of positive and negative. They don't have to be one or the other. For example, Sharon telling the truth to Rhonda about being emotionally insecure was a positive because he told her the truth, but it was also negative because it wasn't exactly what she wanted to hear. I also found that feedback itself can be an expectancy violation. What I mean by that is, for example, when Sharon tells Rhonda he has an emotional wall up, Rhonda sees that as a negative violation, responding with opening up to other men. That makes her response to the negative violation another negative violation. So it's sort of this domino effect. One violation causes feedback, causes violation, causes feedback. So overall, some limitations that I came across was just the formatting of the show itself. It focused a lot on Rhonda's response to Sharon's actions and not the other way around. As I was doing my research, I had a lot less violations on Rhonda's part than Sharon's, simply because that was the way the show was formatted. The camera also definitely could have made a difference. People act super differently in front of a camera, so I could have been viewing completely artificial behaviors, which definitely could have affected my research. And lastly, my research only goes as far as the show does. The relationship itself ended after the show, so obviously there were patterns and behaviors that I could not observe because they weren't in the show. So overall, expectancy violations theory was really interesting to look into in this show particularly, and its relationship to uncertainty and predictability in romantic relationships. Thank you so much.